Hi, this is Alan from Warrendale Community Church, and I'm back. We're discussing, and we're in message number 5, Proving the Will of God, and we're looking at the source. Remember, we've already talked about how important the source in determining and deciding a particular matter is. We talked about in 1 John chapter 4 about how proving the source, test the spirits to see whether they are from God. And we're continuing in the whole idea of testing the source. We can go to Acts chapter 5, verse 34. In Acts chapter 5, verse 34, it was a common practice of testing the source. And you'll see in this verse, but a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, respected by all the people, stood up in the council and gave orders to put the men outside for a short time. And he said to them, Men of Israel, take care what you propose to do with these men. For some time ago, Thaddeus rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him. But he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee, rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him. So he too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. Verse 38, So, in the present case, I say to you, stay away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or action is of God, it will not be overthrown. But if it is of God or from God, you will not be able to overthrow them, or else you may even be found fighting against God. Gamaliel gives a plan for figuring out what God's will is. He says to leave them alone to watch and see. The thing that is under discussion is the preaching of the apostles and the implications of their message. What they are watching for is whether it is from God. If it is from God, or translated of God, one will not be able to overthrow it. If it is from God, you will not be able to fight against it and win. Gamaliel says to the men of Israel, take care with what you are planning to do with these men. They are to take thought of this way of thinking, that if something is of or from man, it will not succeed, but it is from God, it will not be overthrown. They will not be able to stop the movement if it is from God. And such it was, and such it still is. One is fighting against God when one resists that which is coming from God. God's will is unstoppable in his determined will, and this will is from him. Another example of testing is found in Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 10. And Nehemiah tests the source. A supposed word from God is tested for its source. Nehemiah 6:10. When I entered the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, and Mehetabel, who was confined at home, he said, Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you at night. But I said, Should a man like me flee? And could one such as I go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. God had called Nehemiah to restore the walls of the city. The proving process we see was by asking these questions in light of the revealed will of God. He was not a Levite, and so could not enter the temple in this way to stay the night. One other such king tried to do temple-related things in 2 Chronicles 26:16 and became leprous. He would not operate either on the fear of men principle. We know from Proverbs 28:1, it says, The wicked flee when no one is pursuing, but the righteous are as bold as lions. So this is inconsistent with Scripture related to fear. It is inconsistent with Scripture related to the function of a non-Levite entering into the temple and staying there at night. So it further explains in verse 12, Then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, but he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He recognized these men were not sent by God, but they're sent by men. He does not determine this by a prophet, a dream, or a vision. It doesn't appear to be, but by observation of the principle of source, with Scripture as the resource. Other information connected to the idea might have helped them to see that they were hired, but these others had already threatened him and the work as well. He goes on in his reasoning to the will of God in verse 13. It says he was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly in sin, so that they might have an evil report in order that they could reproach me. See, remember, he already told them in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 14, he already told the leaders not to be afraid, but remember how great and awesome God is. He says there in Nehemiah 4:14, when I saw their fear, I arose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your houses. So their plan was to make him act out of fear and then sin against God by entering the temple. They would then use this sin to bring a reproach on him and so stop the work. They would say, see, he defiles the temple and operates out of fear, so you should not trust him. So we see that he used this process of discerning that the source was not from God. Further points out, he hands them over to God in verse 14. Remember, O my God, Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these works of theirs, and also Noadiah, the prophetess, and the rest of the prophets who were trying to frighten me. So he just hands it over because it's not from God. Let God handle it. Another question, which is really interesting, is a source question from Matthew chapter 21. It's a question about, and the question comes in the form of a source, and then the question that Jesus gives as a source. And this is what it says in verse 25. The baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men? And they began reasoning among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say to us, then why did you not believe him? But if we say from men, we fear the people, for they all regard John as a prophet. Verse 27, in answering Jesus, they said, we do not know. He also said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. See, the elders, in verse 23, the elders and chief priests ask him a source and means kind of question. And it is, by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? They are asking a source question, and then he asks them a source question as a condition for answering them. Jesus tells them that they are to apply the testing of the source of John's baptism to answer the source of Christ's authority. Both his ministry of baptism, John's, and Jesus' superior role with its prominence have come from the same origin. And so there is no sense of jealousy. Heaven here is used about the idea of from heaven is a metaphor for God. So the use of from, which refers to the source of power. The point with John is that if it is from heaven, then one should accept it as God's design. They admit it themselves. If they say from heaven, then they knew that they were going to have to believe it. But they refused to believe it because they refused to accept it. They didn't want to come to a conclusion about the source of John's message and authority. But then Jesus says, you would not receive any further information about Christ's authority because you didn't prove and approve of God's message and messenger. And see, this is the two aspects of proving. They would not prove nor approve the source. And they did not want to believe John. So they remained unapproving regarding the source. There's some implications with this that we need to consider in our conclusion. We must not be like these who refuse to prove the source, for they did not want to deal with the implication of their conclusion. We must continue to want to know the source of some revelation, the source of some message, some direction from God. Clearly, there are times that you must prove the will of God or suffer consequences. The first aspect of the proving process of the will of God involves testing the source. Once the source has been determined, then a proper reaction must occur. Refuse to determine, and you might be refused any more information. So it's very important about testing the source. If you want to know God's will, we've already talked about it, being motivated for God's will, then we have to seek to prove it out because it's very important.